It was 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The religious leaders who collaborated with the Roman occupation were conspiring against Jesus. They had gathered in the palace of Caiaphas, the high priest. This man had received the high priesthood at the hands of Valerius Gratus, the former Roman governor, and now retained the office under Pontius Pilate. They were all planning to arrest and destroy Jesus quietly so as to avoid a popular revolt among the Jews. At this time, Jesus was lodging at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper. While he was there, a woman approached and anointed him with an alabaster jar of pure nard. When his disciples saw the act, they were outraged. Then one of the 12, named Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, went to the priests and asked, When they heard the offer, they were glad and promised Judas 30 pieces of silver. From that hour, he sought an opportunity to betray Jesus. At the beginning of the feast, when the Passover lamb was sacrificed, the disciples of Jesus approached him and asked,
Where do you want us to
go and you will see there a man carrying a work. He will show you.
The two did just as Jesus commanded. They entered the city where they found the man with the water jar, who brought them to a larger upper room. When evening had come, Jesus arrived with the 12. While they were eating, he said,
I tell you truly, that one of you is going to betray me.
The disciples were stunned with grief.
Surely not. Nor I.
The betrayer is one of you dipping his hand in the dish with me. The Son of Man is still in Scripture, but woe to that one through whom the Son of Man is betrayed.
Then Judas slipped out into the night. As they were eating, Jesus took bread. After reciting the blessing, he broke it and gave it to his disciples.
Take, eat. This is my body.
Then taking the cup with the traditional blessing, he gave it to the disciples.
This is my blood of the covenant, which is being shed for many. I tell you in truth that I shall not drink again from the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it fresh in the kingdom of God.
Then, having sung a hymn, they left the city for the Mount of Olives. As they walked, Jesus said to his disciples,
You will all desert me this very night. So it is written in the prophet Zechariah, strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered.
Even though all others will desert me, I will remain by you.
I tell you truly, that in this very night, before the morning dawns, you shall deny me 3 times.
Even though I must die with you, I will never deny you.
and so declared all the rest of the disciples. Jesus halted at the olive grove called Gethsemane. Then, going apart with Peter, James, and John, he left them on watch and continued a little further alone. Then he fell on his face in anguished prayer. Soon he returned to the 3 on watch and found them sleeping.
You do not watch with me for just 1 hour. Watch and pray, that you are not put to the test. For the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak.
Again, Jesus went apart in troubled prayer, and again he returned to find the disciples sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. A 3rd time, Jesus withdrew to pray, and a 3rd time he found the disciples sleeping.
Sleep on and finish your rest. Now is the time for the Son of Man to be delivered into the hands of sinners. Here comes my betrayer.
Jesus had not finished speaking before Judas, one of his own disciples, arrived with a group of Roman soldiers and others who were armed from the temple. Now the betrayer had arranged with the authorities for a sign and had said, in accord with this arrangement, Judas went directly to Jesus. Then he gave him the kiss.
Judas,
Immediately, the soldiers laid hands on Jesus and held him fast. One of the disciples with Jesus drew his sword and cut off an ear from the slave of the high priest.
Sheathe your sword. All who take up the sword will perish by the sword. Do you not know that I can call upon God, who will respond at once with more than 12 legions of angels?
Then turning to the mob, Jesus continued,
Have you come for me against the rebel bandit with swords and clubs? Why did you not see me in the temple where I sat teaching by day? Were you so afraid of the Jewish people that you must come for me by stealth? Nevertheless, your actions are fulfilling the words of the prophets.
Then all the disciples forsook him and fled. Those who had seized Jesus brought him to Caiaphas, whom the Romans had made the high priest. Peter followed at a distance as far as the courtyard. Then he sat with the attendants and warmed himself by the fire. The high priest had gathered his whole council, and they began to arrange the case against Jesus, which would be presented to Pontius Pilate, the governor. The charge was that Jesus claimed to be king of the Jews, and they brought in many false witnesses, but to no avail. Finally, 2 came forward.
We heard this man say, I will tear down this temple made with hands, and
The testimony was evidence that Jesus claimed an authority over temple affairs, which traditionally belonged only to the rulers of Israel. And in those days, Israel was ruled from Rome. Yet even these witnesses were unable to agree on their testimony. Finally, Caiaphas stood up and examined Jesus directly. Jesus remained silent and answered nothing. Then the high priest put the question of kingship in terms of the royal titles, anointed and Son of God.
I am, and you shall see the Son of Man seated on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven.
They all concurred that Jesus was indeed worthy of death. Then those holding Jesus began to spit on him. They covered his face and were striking him as they taunted him.
O anointed one, prophesy who it is who striking you.
Now Peter was warming himself in the courtyard when a small slave girl entered. She confronted Peter and said,
You also will be. I do not know what you are talking about.
Peter went outside into the gateway. Meanwhile, the cock crowed. The slave girl followed him out and said to the bystanders.
This man is one of them.
Again, Peter denied knowing Jesus. After a little while, the bystanders said directly to Peter.
Surely you are one of them. You speak with a Galilean accent.
Then Peter began to swear with an oath.
I do not know this person of whom you are speaking.
But the cock interrupted him as he crowed for a second time. Immediately, Peter remembered how Jesus had said to him, "Before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." He went out and wept bitterly. When the morning arrived, all the chief priests, along with the other Roman collaborators, bound Jesus and delivered him over to Pontius Pilate, the imperial Roman governor. When Judas saw what was happening, he knew Jesus was doomed and repented. He returned the 30 pieces of silver to the priests. Judas threw down the 30 pieces of silver in the temple. Then he went out and hanged himself. Picking up the silver pieces, the priest said, whereupon they used the money to buy the potter's field for the burial of strangers. Therefore, that field is known to this day as the field of blood. Jesus stood before the Roman governor as the accusers made their charge.
We found this man, Lord in our midst.
The priests were accusing him of many things.
Have you no answer to give? Look at how many accusations they are making.
Jesus astonished Pilate by remaining silent. At that festival, the governor used to release a prisoner, and some were urging Pilate to do so at this time. Now there was a notable rebel in prison with those who had committed murder during the insurrection. His name was Barabbas.
Who do you want me to release for you? Barabbas or shall I do then with Jesus the anointed? You certainly are guilty.
The crowd took up the chant.
Shall I crucify your king?
Then Pilate agreed to release Barabbas, but Jesus, the anointed king, he handed over to the soldiers for scourging and crucifixion. The soldiers led Jesus away with from the governor's palace. There they were assembled, the whole battalion. They clothed Jesus in royal purple. They set a crown of thorns upon his head and put a reed between his fingers for a scepter. They began to mock him by kneeling before him.
Hail, King of the Jews.
They also spat on him and smote him on the head with a stick. Then, after mocking him, they took away the purple robe, returned his own clothes, and brought him out to crucify him. On the road, they met an African of Cyrene named Simon coming in from the countryside. They compelled him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to a place called Golgotha, which means skull.
Please stand.
There they crucified him. It was 9 a.m. They offered him wine mingled with myrrh, but he refused it. They divided his garments among them, casting lots for them. Over his head they inscribed the charge against him, the King of the Jews. Also, there were 2 insurrectionists crucified with him, one to his right and one to his left. Those who passed by were shaking their heads in derision. Likewise, the priestly collaborators mocked him. Even the 2 crucified with him reviled him. Now from midday there was darkness over the whole land until 3 p.m. At that hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice,
Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me?
One of them put a sponge full of vinegar on a stick and laid it to his lips. Then Jesus, having uttered a loud cry, breathed his last breath. Suddenly, the curtain of the temple was torn in 2 from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks were split. Even the tombs of the dead were opened. Now, when the centurion on watch and the others who were with him saw all that was taking place, they were filled with awe.
This man truly was God's royal son. Thank you, everybody, for your reading.